Number 10, bears for pets. Okay, right off the bat, let's get crazy. Some of the hardest character deaths in Game of Thrones were definitely the direwolves. Also, spoiler alert, but also you had 8 years, so Wolves as pets sounds like something Vikings would do for sure, but more often than not, they would just have dogs and cats just like us. Few of these animals were kept as pets, really. They all had a Viking purpose. They all had the big cats probably had a big beard too, most likely. Viking cats belonged in the house to chase away rodents, just like they do today. Freya, the goddess of love in Norse mythology, rides in a cart that's being pulled by 2 cats. Cutest little cart ever. These cats were Egyptian. Most of the cats in Scandinavia came from Egypt at that time, and they adapted to a much colder climate. Viking dogs were also a thing. They were often found in graves next to human remains, so the man's best friend thing goes way back. They were hunting dogs and herding dogs, and they too followed their masters to Valhalla, hence why the bones would always be found together after death. Here's the crazy part though, Vikings would also domesticate bears from cubhood. Yeah, they would have Viking bears as pets. What a fun way to kick this list off. Number 9, Norse paganism. If you're a fan of the MCU, this guy Thor here with the cape and the hammer and the big muscles, odds are you've heard of him before Nick Fury introduced you. Thor and Odin, they come from Norse mythology. The Aesir are the main gods of the pantheon. Those include Thor, Odin, and even Loki. And yes, in Norse mythology, they lived on Asgard. It's not just MCU stuff, one of the 9 realms. So they believed that if they fought hard enough and lived the most fierce warrior lives they could, they would end up in the halls of Valhalla to join Odin in the fires of Ragnarok, the most fierce battle of all. The Vikings didn't have a name for their religion at first, so when they eventually ran into Christianity, they called it the Old Way, which just sounds cool. It's like, ah yes, the old way. It's referred to today as the Asatru, that's the worship of Norse gods. That term became popular in the 19th century, so it came much later. There was a Nordic religion society in Denmark that had around 600 members, and that was back in 1997, so pretty recently, and it was approved officially in 2003. Believers now can mostly be found throughout Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. Number 8, horned helmets. Okay, when you think of Vikings, you probably imagine a very large man and a big ass beard with some horns. You got a horn to blow on, a horn to drink wine out of or something, or some ale, and then 2 horns here on your helmet. Just the horniest fella. Well, aside from looking cool, this horned helmet would have served absolutely no purpose to a warrior in combat. I don't know, unless there's a guy out there just headbutting all of his opponents individually, I don't know. The horned helmets were only introduced into Norse culture when costume designer Carl Emil Doppler made them for Norse-themed operas in the 19th century. So it's really just modern art that we're thinking of. Also, Thor surely doesn't help. He has like wings on his helmet. I'm like, is that real or is that just Chris Hemsworth? I can't tell the difference. Number 7, hockey. I had to share this one, you know, being a Canadian and all, this one hurt. We found out that hockey wasn't our thing during Canada's 150th celebration. How epic is that? Oops, timing. I'm cold a lot of the time. My face hurts here in Canada. It hurts when I walk to the store and get my weird bagged milk and then I return back to my igloo. You know how it is. That's the idea, right? That Canadians are cold and they play hockey all the time. Well, honestly, yeah, pretty much, not too far off. Well, hockey isn't just our favorite winter activity. Vikings loved it too. They actually brought it here in the first place, believe it or not. They didn't call it hockey also, they called it a way better name. They called it slap and fatten, which means to slap the fat around. You slap some fat with a stick. Me and the boys are gonna go around and do some road slap and fatten. Car, heads up, pause the slap and fatten, let's get out of here. Vikings would get sticks and try and slap some fat in between 2 posts. Imagine getting cross-checked by a Viking. See you later, chest plate. Number 6, what's that smell? You would think that just looking at a Viking that they would probably smell bad. I don't know, they're by the sea a lot, they're always damp, there's lots of hair. I mean, the beards alone probably suck up 1% of the ocean. Barnacles and all that jazz. But believe it or not, these Vikings didn't smell bad, they were actually known for their hygiene. When excavations were done and all these sites that Vikings lived at, well, rather raided and then lived at, ancient hygiene tools were found. So like tweezers, combs, ear cleaners, they were into it. They weren't lucky enough to have Q-tips back then, so instead they used animal bones, which wouldn't hurt too much. Your eyes wouldn't really roll for that one, I don't think. It's just business, no pleasure. Vikings would bathe once a week, which to us sounds like a risky move, but once a week for that time period, that's amazing, that's unheard of. Queen Elizabeth I would only bathe once a month. So put that in comparison. Mind you, when you're hauling gear throughout a forest and then you have to use your axe for 4 hours straight, you might sweat a little bit more than the Queen.
Number 5. Eric the Red. Probably the most infamous Viking who ever lived, and the father of Leif Erikson was Eric the Red. He earned this name most likely because of his gorgeous red hair and beard, or it could be because he's the bloodthirsty Viking of your worst nightmares. When you think of the classic Viking, this is really what comes to mind. A drinking brute who could cleave a man in twain with a swing of his war axe. What I'm getting at is, getting bloodstains out of clothes is difficult today, but imagine what it was like back then. Yikes! Ladies, how many times has your husband come home from his blue-collar job and just gotten himself into a mess? Also, take your boots off before you come into the house, dude. Come on, that's just not cool. Eric the Red most likely did the same, however, he was not covered in mustard from lunch or grease stains from the garage, but rather the fluids that can only come from separating body parts from unwilling donors. I get lightheaded just thinking about it, no thanks. Number 4. Strong, independent woman. Freydis was sister of Leif Erikson and daughter of Eric the Red. She had some strong blood in her. While not exactly Leif's wife, this story is just too messed up to not tell. This one goes to all the mothers out there. Remember your first child, remember the joys of your first pregnancy. For some lucky women, this is an easy experience, but for others, well, for others it's difficult to say the least. You might notice that your body is changing, and all of a sudden, you're really craving food you haven't had in a long time. You may also feel a little queasy in the morning, and many other little fun things that happen. Well, Freydis, the sister of Leif Erikson, went on that North American expedition with him, whilst pregnant, which I can also imagine was just a beautiful pleasure cruise. However, her level of seasickness is not what's so messed up here, but rather that she had to defend herself by swinging a sword whilst very pregnant. That's a down bad woman right there. Number 3. Red flags. Dating can be fun. You get to meet new people and experience new things, mini golf, movies, maybe even some nice restaurants. However, sometimes when we go on dates, they make better stories than experiences. Sometimes people give off red flags. People who put ketchup on pizza is a red flag for me. That's wrong. Don't do that. Meet Egil Skallagrimsson. No, he didn't put ketchup on pizza, but he was a mean, no good, rotten man of a Viking. But apparently was also an excellent poet. As the legends go, he got his first taste of blood when he was 7, when another young man crossed him. He then reached for his axe. You know what happens next. He grew up to be just the way you think Vikings grow up to be, and his violence carried on throughout his life. However, unlike most barbaric coastal raiders of the time, Egil was also thought to be somewhat of a prolific writer, as his poems are considered to be some of the best from ye olde Scandinavia. Ladies, I don't have to tell you how toxic this is, right? This is a big red flag energy. Imagine getting in a brutal confrontation with him, then he turns around and makes it into a compelling poem. Red flags all the way. No thanks. Number 2. Pay to win. Ragnar Lodbrok isn't just a name that sounds like he could be a Dovahkiin from Skyrim. It's a name that struck fear into many Anglo and Franco kingdoms at the time. You never know when someone like Ragnar would show up in a boat with 30 other burly Vikings and just mess up your day royally. One royal that did not want his day being royally screwed up by Ragnar paid him to stop Vikingizing his village. Vikingizing is a word I'm going to use. Which honestly is like asking water not to be wet. Yes, water is wet, the debate starts and ends there. Perhaps Ragnar was actually close in similarities to the Dovahkiin, as I find it's easier to stop using my dragon shout when gold comes my way. Well, if he had to be paid off like a goon for hire, you can imagine how sweet and caring he was to his wives. Yeah, probably not, no. Number 1. Vikings. Look, this is another broad stroke, but guys, these are Vikings, and this was ye olde Europe. Yes, women did have more freedoms than others in Viking society, but it's just not a good time. And honestly, if you try looking through any lens of the present into the past, you're gonna find some things you don't like. Vikings were Vikings, and unfortunately for women at the time, that just meant they got the raw end of the deal, for a multitude of reasons. Whew. Glad we live in today, not then. Number 10. Patterns. Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I'm starting to notice a pattern. What's that pattern exactly? Well, I'm starting to notice that maybe other Europeans were nicer than at least mainlander ones. I'll get into it. Was Vikings giving their women's rights messed up? No, of course not. I'm not a monster. However, you just gotta understand that a lot of other women in Europe did not share these privileges, like owning property, marriage rights. They even had the right to be warriors. While only a small fraction of women were involved, there are a couple sources that refer to female warriors, such as the War Maidens. Now, mind you, Vikings were coastal raiders, not so much a professional army, but still, it's about the freedoms, so you slay on, Valkyrie warrior, slay on. Number 9. Marriage. Okay, well, there was more freedom, but let's be honest, this was a long time ago and not 2022, so not everything was perfect. The marriages were oftentimes arranged by both families and watched over by elders. What's the average age of a bride-to-be, you ask? Well, the bride is a little bit older, and some might call it a midlife crisis, but she's getting married at the age of 13. Lucky number. Sadly, this is just how it went for many civilizations of the day. I'll make the joke again that you don't have that long to live back then, so sure, it makes sense, I guess. Just looking back through the lens of time just makes my skin want to crawl when you do that. Ugh, yucky. I'll stick to the coastal raiding and the pillaging, thanks. Number 8. Grooms, tombs, and drogers. Ladies, wasn't your wedding night beautiful, surrounded by friends and family, a nice meal, and if you've been married long enough, maybe even some bad hair, and tuxedos that went out of fashion the second you walked off the altar. All while being recorded on the first camcorders that were big enough to be bazookas. God, I miss the 70s and 80s. Well, Vikings had some weird things going on too. No, not those bright blue tuxedos. I never understood how that was in style. It was just really weird. Vikings had this tradition where the groom would raid his family's tomb and retrieve a ceremonial weapon. Afterwards, he would take a very hot bath and sweat out the scent of the tomb, I guess? I'm not really sure. Where then his hair was stylized and somewhere a symbol of Thor was placed on him. I don't know about you guys, but that sounds like a lot. I prefer our tradition of drinking too much in the sun before the wedding starts and falling over at the altar. That's a much better one. Number 7. Blood. Ladies, if your husband's dungeon crawling wasn't enough to creep you out, then the poor Viking women had more strange traditions for you. The Gothi, or basically a Viking priest, who makes the wedding happen, would often sacrifice an animal in front of the whole wedding to prove that he was capable of commencing a wedding, pouring blood on himself and oftentimes spraying the newlyweds, as it was seen as good for some strange reason. For immediate family, you might want to sit back as you're in the splash zone. And because this is the time before well-taught and understood sanitation, I'm sure there was a grand feast afterwards. I'm sure that won't make anyone sick, right? Number 6. Quiet time. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, Big Ched, having blood sprayed on me at my wedding is kind of messed up. But you haven't made your chief joke yet. Does that mean there's something worse than impersonating 1976 Carrie at our wedding? Well, yes there is. And actually, I'm glad you asked. So, when two people fall in love and get married, and maybe have a little bit too much champagne, they go home to put on the final signatures of the marriage. If you catch my drift. Two young lovers dancing the devil's dance in the bedroom sheets for the first time because everybody waits until marriage. However, for Viking women, there's a tradition that us today would be mostly uncomfortable with. Or, I mean, at least if you don't have an OnlyFans, maybe not, I don't know. But when the young couple went back to do what young couples do, they had witnesses. Oh yeah, that's right. At least 6 witnesses apparently, just to make sure things go over smoothly. I moseyed on into town the other day and, you know what the chief said? That ain't it.
On number 5, building fires. The Vikings were some pretty innovative people, but they were also kinda gross. This gross behavior applied to a lot of things, but one of those things was their fire building. Now you're probably asking yourself, Bree, what's so gross about making a fire? Well, it's the way that they started the fire that was kinda grody. You see, nowadays we have a bunch of things that we can use to start a fire. We have matches, lighters, lighter fluid, and a bunch of other things. But obviously back in the days of the Vikings, they didn't have those fire starting tools, and so they had to improvise. The Vikings came up with a nifty little trick to start a fire where they took a fungus called touchwood and they would beat it and burn it until it turned into a thin, flat thing that kind of looked like felt. Then they decided to get gross and would then boil the touchwood in human urine because urine contained sodium nitrate, which would help the touchwood turn into something that would smolder rather than burn. They could then take this stuff with them and use it to start fires whenever they wanted so they could cook food over their urine-fueled fire. Sounds delightful. At number 4, conning. Conning people has been something that's kind of been part of many societies since probably the dawn of civilization. Anyone can con anyone into doing anything or buying anything. I mean, people do it on eBay all the time. But apparently, the Vikings were also known to con people probably for their own enjoyment, because they're Vikings. Back in the day, the Vikings would do trades with the Inuit people and they would acquire narwhal tusks from them. The Vikings would then sell those tusks to other people, marketing them as unicorn horns, and let's face it, no one's gonna turn down buying a unicorn horn. Because of the Vikings and their cunning ways, by the Middle Ages, people not only believed that unicorns were actually real, but that they also had magical powers. So in a way, if you were obsessed with unicorns as a kid, you can thank the Vikings for that. At number 3, house bears. Humans seem to be pretty good at domesticating animals. We domesticated dogs by accident, and now they're considered man's best friend. We domesticated livestock for food and other purposes. We domesticated horses to be our transportation and carry things, so we kind of know our way around animals and could probably make anything into our pet if we really wanted to. But the Vikings weren't just satisfied with dogs, horses, and livestock. They were the mighty Vikings and they needed mighty pets, and that's why they kept bears as their companions. Yes, bears. Now don't get me wrong, the Vikings also had normal pets like dogs and cats, and they would even sometimes bring them along on their expeditions, but they also really liked bears. It is said that when they weren't out laying siege to someone's town or sailing the seas, the Vikings would visit bear dens and take bear cubs home with them. They would then raise the cubs as house bears. But having a house bear was also a very big responsibility. You had to make sure that your bear was kept in check at all times, so that meant no eating people or livestock, no disturbing your neighbors, and if your bear did get into trouble, you would either get hit with a fine or be banned from having a house bear. So maybe it's best to stick with normal pets like dogs. At number 2, worthy kids. The Vikings were ruthless even when it came to their spawn. I mean their kids. These guys were really picky when it came to having a family because they weren't afraid to just yeet their kids if they didn't like them enough. Back in their day, when a baby was born, they would christen their kid with a name during a ceremony called Asavatni, but only after determining if this kid was even worth raising in the first place. You see, when a baby was delivered, the child would be placed on the ground for the father to then pick up and examine. He would be looking for any physical deformities, disabilities, and to determine if the kid was actually his or not. He would decide if the kid had a future. If they did, then they would hold the Asavatni ceremony where water was sprinkled on the kid's head and given a name, and if they weren't worthy, then they would be left outside in the elements and abandoned. And finally, at number 1, criminal profiling. It turns out that the Vikings kind of invented criminal profiling. You see, when the Viking horde would set off to battle, there was no telling how they would return. You have to remember that these guys were bloodthirsty and violent, and there was no telling what was going on in their heads. I mean, don't even get me started on the whole berserker rage thing because that itself is very intense. But basically, when the horde would return home, they seemed to have caused a lot of problems because many of them couldn't turn off their rage and would just wreak havoc on the town. To deal with this, it is said that a series of Icelandic sagas were written as a sort of profile to warn the homegrown Vikings of what to look out for when the others would return. They had to kind of alter their stories a little bit because if they were too specific, then it would have caused people to learn to be afraid of basically any Viking man, so they had to keep things a little generic, but for the most part, people learned to stay away from those who couldn't turn off the berserker rage at home in order to keep themselves and the rest of their community safe. At number 10, NonStop Party. What is the longest amount of time you've gone out to party? A couple hours? Maybe a weekend? Well, I don't think it could ever compare to how long the Vikings partied. The Vikings would have probably had a good old chuckle if they knew our parties only lasted a few hours. They'd be like, ha, look at these weaklings. Anyway, these guys could probably out-party anyone. Their biggest festivities, like the ones held after large expeditions or for weddings, would typically last for days, but their major feasts, like the ones they would use to celebrate the winter solstice, may have lasted upwards of 12 days. Now that's a lot of party stamina. I would probably need about 50 Red Bulls to even try and keep up with these Vikings.
Number 9, actual really good food. Like pretty decent food. If you're a foodie, then I do have some good news for you. The Vikings were apparently like pretty decent cooks. For the time anyways. They stocked their parties with roasted meats like poultry, horse, and beef, with platters of greens, fruits, and buttered vegetables. Beer, ale, mead, and fruit wines were the common beverages, and heavy drinking was encouraged. Not unlike bars today, where there's always that one person who keeps secretly buying tequila shots for everybody, and then you're like, okay fine, I'll take it because I don't want to be rude, you know what I mean? Anyways, considering the fact that parties would sometimes last for weeks on end, having a lot of food in their party hut was super important. They needed enough to last them until the partying was done, which who knows when that would be.
At number 8, rap battles. Every party has to have some kind of activity, right? I mean, yeah, we can all stand around listening to music and kikiing it up, but it's way more fun to have activities to participate in, right? Well, the Vikings certainly knew how to throw a party because they had their collection of party activities to choose from, and it sounded kind of like a hoot and a half until we get to the other parts of this list and, just throw that out the window. They would set up games like dice and chess, or at least their early Viking version of chess, and even board games. The Vikings also had this super fun drinking game called flighting, where partygoers would team up and recite poetry. They would drop some sick bars about their conquests and exploits, and would even drop a diss or two at their opponents, like a Drake versus Kanye moment. Oh, wait, no, they're friends now. Damn. Well, scratch that last part, but you know what I mean. On top of rap battles and board games, Viking parties just wouldn't be a proper event without drinking, and they even played a game to see who could drink the most. Honestly, I kind of feel bad for the Vikings' livers after all that, and imagine that hangover. Yikes.
Number 7. Vicious tunes. Ever had a neighbor who would decide to throw a banger on like a weekday? Or have a roommate who thinks they are really good at guitar and wants to prove it 24/7? They're like, wow, at 4 a.m. Yeah, it sucks. If you don't enjoy scenarios similar to this, then you would not want to live next door to a Viking encampment. These folks rocked out really hard and for, as we know, a long period of time. They loved live music, as do I, and archaeologists have recovered flutes, hornpipes, and stringed instruments from settlements. But as most of the singers were well into the mead, according to Arab travelers, they weren't easy on the ears. Picture the moment Bohemian Rhapsody comes on in a bar and the screeches sounds everyone makes as they try to say Galileo really loud. My voice is dead. That would be awful. One account described their singing comparable to the calls of wild animals. Oh boy, that's rough. But sometimes they would switch it up with some poetry, as mentioned, by skilled artists called skalds.
At number 6, full send or no send. It seems like the Vikings lived by the notion full send or no send because, man, the things get wild and crazy at their parties. There was no holding back with these guys. Oh no. I know I previously mentioned some of the activities that the Vikings would have at their parties, but those ones were the tame ones, and if you know the Vikings, they can't have PG-friendly shindigs. Of course not. There's gotta be scenes of violence and coarse language. Viewer discretion is advised. Other than playing chess and having rap battles, they also had mass casualties. They played games where people literally kicked the bucket, but I guess dying at a party this wild is a good enough way to go. Some of their more dangerous party activities included throwing leftover bones at one another with the deliberate intent of inflicting bodily harm. They also played a full contact bat and ball game that would often end in injury, or the big sleep. And they also held a swimming contest. But there wasn't that much actual swimming involved since the point of the game was to hold their opponent underwater for as long as possible. I would have to imagine that these so-called games would just make for a vicious cycle because they'd celebrate something, play these games, kill someone, and then the funeral will have them celebrating again just to do it all over again. What a wild life these Vikings lived.
Number 5. How to ward off Draugr. Draugr, for those who didn't play Skyrim, are a Viking denomination of the undead. It's presumed as a certainty that when a person is buried in the ground, they will rise from the dead as a Draugr. From there, they'll attack people, and everyone will generally have a bad time until the Draugr is killed via decapitation, dismemberment, or any act of making it just not move anymore. To prevent this from happening in the first place, Viking land burials were done extremely carefully. Straw would be placed under the body and scissors would be laid on the chest, while their toes were sewn together and nails were pushed through their feet. They would then deconstruct a portion of the house and take the corpse out through it, reconstructing it later, as Draugr were believed to follow the path back from their place of burial. They would then be entombed, and all of the items they'd owned that remained in their house would be turned upside down until their grave was magically sealed. Number 4. Berserkers. A denomination of shamans, berserkers were warriors trained to fight and channel various spirits into their body. There were 3 schools of berserker: the wolf, boar, and bear, each one serving a slightly different role. To train, these berserkers were sent out into the wilderness to become more in tune with nature, and also drive themselves insane in the process. This would supposedly imbue them with the strengths of their respective school of combat, and so when they were called upon to enter into Norse conflicts, they were supposedly given the ability to transform into their their respective animal, ripping the opposing warriors to shreds. This account is shared both by Vikings and the victims of Vikings, though it is more than likely that this is just an exaggeration meant to imply the bestial behavior of a berserker when in a trance. Number 3. The Blood Eagle. This one is not for the faint of heart. A ritualistic form of execution, the Blood Eagle is an extremely violent method of dispatching enemies, which is described in the sagas. For a long period of time, these were thought to have been fictional, but as recent bodies have been unearthed that appear to have been victims of the Blood Eagle, there seems to be more truth to this than initially thought. The Blood Eagle involves the victim being laid on their front and a knife being used to separate their ribs from their spine. The spine is then removed and their lungs are spread out in the form of crimson wings, creating the eponymous Blood Eagle. Number 2. The Bloat. The Bloat was set as a ritual that would occur once every season at 4 set intervals in a year, but another could be organized if circumstances required it. The most well-recorded bloat was one performed by Sigurd Håkonsson. Detailed by Snorri Sturluson in the saga of Hakon the Good, this ritual involved a massive amount of human and animal sacrifices, as well as sacrifices of weaponry. Blood was also collected and splattered on the walls, altars, and participants. A feast would then be had and toasts would be made, first to the gods and then to the fallen. Number 1. Viking chief cremation ceremonies. We've all heard of Viking cremations, how they load their dead bro onto the ship and sail it out into the ocean, sending a flaming arrow into it so that they might be buried at sea. However, if it was a chief that died, things would get a little bit more screwed up and nasty. First off, one of the chief's girls would then volunteer or be volunteered to join the chief in the afterlife. She would then be made to get mad drunk and then would be made to sleep with every single man in the village. Seriously. She would then be strangled, stabbed, and loaded onto the boat and the whole fire thing would go down. What can I say except what?